Hello everyone, my name is Francesco Franda and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Buffalo. So let me quickly share my screen here so that you can see my slides. There you go. So today I'm going to talk about causality convention and natural kinds. Lacking a better combination of words, I gave my presentation the standard triadic title, but I know it is a cliche in a lot of analytic philosophy literature, but here it is. So what I'm going to present on is part of my dissertation on social kinds. My presentation sets out three goals. First, I'll focus on the causal account of natural kinds given by Mohammed Ali Khalidi. This account has the merit to include social kinds as candidates for natural kindness, but it fails insofar as it doesn't include conventional social kinds. Then I'll argue that the stable property cluster account, SPC, offered by Matthew Slater, it is the best account of conventional social kinds. Finally, I'll argue for an anti-realist account of social kinds, compatible with the CPC account. Okay, let's start by clarifying what I mean by natural kind here. A distinction that comes in handy is the one P.D. Magnus draws between the taxonomy question on the one hand and the ontology question on the other hand. To put it in the way Neil Williams puts it, the taxonomy question asks what natural kinds are, whereas the ontology question asks what they consist of. So we may answer the taxonomy question by saying that natural kinds are kinds that serve an inductive and explanatory purpose, whereas we may answer the ontology question by saying that natural kinds have essences or homeostatic property clusters. Or if you're a pluralist, you might say that some kinds, like those pertaining to particle physics, have essences, whereas others, such as species, have homeostatic property clusters. My answer to the taxonomy question is that natural kinds are kinds that are projectable, namely, they serve an inductive role. This is a pretty standard answer to the taxonomy question, and it helps clarifying, to put it in a Cartesian way, what we talk about when we talk about natural kinds. A quick terminological note, I believe that it's unfortunate that we still use the expression natural kind, because as we will see, I believe that there are natural kinds that are not to be found only in the natural world, but also in the social world. But anyway, I'm not gonna argue here for terminological change. So let's look now at the answer that Khalidi gives to the ontology question. I previously mentioned the homeostatic property cluster account, HPC. This account, firstly offered by Richard Boyd in the 90s, has been an influential alternative to what was the dominating centuries approach up until that point. Homeostatic property clusters occur when there are mechanisms that cause certain properties to cluster together. And so the presence of some of the properties in the cluster favors the presence of the others. And so there is a homeostatic mechanism in place. This account was meant to treat in particular species. I mentioned the HPC account because Khalidi's account of natural kinds keeps the insight that causality matters to natural kinds, but it gets rid of the notion of homeostatic mechanism, which has problems that Khalidi and others have pointed out. For example, the problem is that there is no clear relation between the mechanism and the properties. Another problem is that homeostasis is not necessary in most species, and there are other issues that we don't need to get into. So the result is a simple causal account of natural kinds. According to Khalidi, and I'm quoting here, Khalidi, natural kinds are associated with a set of properties that are causally linked to other properties. So the property of these causal relations grounds the inductive property, the inductive power of the kind. For example, and this is an example taken from Khalidi, the chemical isotope lithium-7 is associated with the properties atomic number 3 and mass number 7. And what makes lithium-7 a natural kind is not just the regular co-occurrence of these two properties in nature, but the fact that other properties causally follow from those two properties, such as certain values for density, melting point, electric conductivity, and so on. So natural kinds have been usually considered to be the categories that we find in the natural sciences, such as physics and chemistry. And kinds from other sciences have been usually ignored. Khalidi's account of natural kinds has the merit to include more kinds as natural, in particular from the social sciences. However, not all social kinds are natural kinds. Khalidi argues that only those social kinds whose property are causally related are natural kinds, but social kinds whose properties are conventionally related are not natural kinds, because the fact that the properties are associated is because of convention and not causality. And this implies that the kind hasn't been discovered, but it has been invented. So, for example, economic recession may be a natural kind, given that for something to be a recession, you need economic transactions, a certain amount of trained industrial activity, a certain level of unemployment, and so on. And all of this phenomena involve some causal properties. But for example, the properties of the social kind permanent resident aren't causal because they are arbitrarily written into it. And so it can't be a natural kind. So this is Khalidi's argument reconstruction. Now, I agree with premise 1. We give sort of the same answer to the taxonomy question, and with premise 3, that no conventional social kind is associated with properties that are causally related. But I deny premise 2, namely that all projectable kinds are associated with properties that are causally related. And I like to show this point by giving examples of projectable kinds that are not associated with causal property. So let's start with linguistic kinds. First off, linguistics deals with a phenomenon that is social par excellence, language. Linguistics seeks prediction like empirical sciences do, although of course with a different method. And these predictions are part of explanation and generalizations within languages or across languages. So take, for example, the kind noun and pronoun. Their instances have number, gender, case, or take the kind verb. Its instances have the person, number, voice, mood. Now, it doesn't take an expert to know about this kinds and their associated properties. But the point is that linguistic kinds have a explanatory inductive power. When you recognize an instance of noun or verb or pronoun, you'll infer that they have certain properties. And these properties they have are not causal properties. However, one might say that unlike prime minister and permanent resident, linguistic kinds aren't the product of convention the way Khalidi conceives it. And now Khalidi talks about social kinds that are product of convention when he talks about those social kinds that can be natural kinds. But what he means by that is really by fiat decisions. Languages, so he's a bit ambiguous when he uses the term convention, or rather than ambiguous, he's imprecise. Language is a product of convention in a sense of convention that is the meaning that David Lewis gave to this term as a solution to a coordination problem. And this doesn't entail that all kind of convention is by fiat decision. So some solutions to coordination problems can be unconscious or not necessarily by sitting around the table and deciding how to solve a certain issue. Now, of course, sure, there are instances of institutions that regulate language in a fiat manner. So, say the Académie Française that regulates the language by fiat, but the French language itself, as a whole, wasn't created by fiat decision. But even if language is a product of convention, not by fiat, the properties associated with linguistic kinds are not causal properties. So Khalidi's view misses the fact that there are social kinds which are not products of fiat conventions, but they're still not causally related. However, I believe that you can also find examples of social kinds that are created by fiat decision and that are projectable kinds, and therefore natural kinds. And these are legal kinds, something that Khalidi believes are not natural kinds. So here I'm talking about the simple study of law, the science of law, if you want. So I'm talking about study of law in a descriptive manner. So I'm not talking about philosophy of law, or anything I'm saying presupposes any philosophical principle about law, like natural law theory or legal positivism. So if we look at a legal system, we see how legal kinds allow for predictions within and across legal systems. So for example, let's look at the legal kinds, civil law and criminal law in the US system. On the one hand, when you look at a civil law case, you infer that it involves some disputes between individuals or organizations or the two. So for example, divorce proceedings or landlord-tenant disputes or property disputes and so on. You know that the kind of punishment involved is a compensation for injuries or damage that is provided to the victim. And you know that the burden of proof is on the plaintiff. On the other hand, when you look at criminal law, you know that it deals with crimes such as theft or robbery or murder, assault, and so on. You know that the punishment is by incarceration and or fine, or even in some states, that penalty. And you know that the burden of proof falls on the state or the government. So by looking at the kinds, at the legal kinds, we infer a host of properties that help us making predictions about the instances of legal cases. In this case, all the properties are have been conferred by fiat decisions, and these properties are not causal. Now, one might agree with me and saying that linguistic and legal kinds are natural kinds, but might raise the objection that there is a causal history behind that made the kinds the way they are. Of course, a complicated series of causes and effects, and this is what gave the properties the inductive power, the kinds, the inductive power they have. And this complicated history of causes is what connected the properties in the way they are. Now, I agree that there is a complicated causal history leading to the emergence of the properties in the kind. However, this doesn't entail that the properties associated with the kinds are themselves causal. For instance, the property of being subjunctive of a verb, or the property of being legally binding of an agreement, are not causal properties, even if there's a causal history behind this. So another question is, if the causal account, simple causal account given by Khalidi fails, and also the essentialist and HPC accounts aren't up to the task, is there an account that works? And I think there is, and I believe it's the stable property cluster account, SPC, which has been recently offered by Matthew Slater. SPC kinds are associated with clusters of properties that have to be sufficiently stably co-instantiated in order to accommodate inductive uses. This is the core of the SPC account. So the SPC account then doesn't focus on the ontological ground for induction, but rather the epistemic ground for induction. So it does something that no account of natural kind did before, which focus mainly on the ontological ground for induction. So this account then has the advantage to be able to be applied to all conventional social kinds, even if Slater himself didn't apply his account to any kind of social kind yet, at least. Now, the CPC account has certainly a pragmatic and anti-realist flavor, and in the sense that natural kinds are not out there in the world waiting to be discovered, but they depend on our particular scientific research and even research projects. And this means that some kinds may be natural kinds in certain domains, but not in others. So under this account, natural kinds don't carve nature at its joints. Property has been always thought to be necessary of natural kinds. And this idea clashes with the a realist view of social kinds that has gained some traction, maybe a lot of traction in recent years among social ontologists. The claim is that social kinds, at least some social kinds, are independent of our intentionality. The argument supporting this view has been originally provided by Amy Thomason in her critique of John Searle's social ontology, and it has been later used and developed by Khalidi himself and Francesco. The argument states that social kind, like economic recession or racism, are independent of our intentionality because they would exist even if we didn't even know about them. Recessions would hit our economy even if we didn't know about them. They exist in our nature. And racist acts would still be performed even if the perpetrator and the victim weren't aware of the nature, of the racist nature of the action. What I think about this is that I agree that economic recessions happen long before economists classified them as such. And implicit racial discrimination exists. However, what I believe is that the argument mistakes the existence of the single instances of a kind with the kind itself. And these are two separate things. There's a difference between, on the one hand, the social phenomena taking place in the world, and on the other hand, the categories we use to contour the lines of this phenomena. Now, I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that economic recessions and racism are just things in our head. They really take place out there in the world. But we come up with categories that group these entities together. It's important to notice that this doesn't mean that anything goes. There are better or worse ways to group these entities together. And of course, we have to categorize things into kinds in a way that isn't always perfect. And it's never perfect. So even when we categorize things in a way that is projectable, that doesn't mean that is there could be a better way to do it. But still, if we didn't have this capacity for categorizing, we all know that we would end up like Funes, Borges' character, who is able to remember every single detail of his life, but he is unable to generalize because he doesn't have categories, and this doesn't make him being able to reason at all. Okay, thank you so much for virtually attending my talk, and I am looking forward to hearing your thoughts about it.